Smoke rose over Los Angeles, a hazy shroud settling over the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Golden State's sunlit streets were transforming into a battleground, a scene broadcast worldwide, capturing the world's attention. News cameras zoomed in, reporters narrated, and the world watched as Los Angeles burned. A controversial court verdict served as the spark, igniting the tinderbox of simmering tensions. The gavel fell, the decision was made, and the consequences were immediate and explosive. But the anger, the frustration, the sense of injustice had been building for years, a slow burn that finally reached its flashpoint. It was a culmination of grievances, a breaking point for a community pushed to its limits, fueled by economic hardship, the weight of financial strain crushing families and communities. Businesses shuttered, jobs vanished, and the promise of prosperity seemed a distant dream for many. Inequality, the stark contrast between the haves and have-nots, and a deep-seated distrust in institutions, the very systems meant to protect and serve. The people felt abandoned, betrayed by those in power. What began as a peaceful protest, a collective expression of discontent, quickly became a wave of unrest, a torrent of pent-up rage unleashed onto the streets. The line between demonstration and destruction blurred as emotions ran high, spreading like wildfire from LA to cities across the state, engulfing California in a state of emergency. From the coast to the valleys, the unrest rippled outwards, leaving its mark on every corner of the Golden State. Storefronts shattered, windows smashed, the dreams of small business owners lying in pieces on the pavement. Police cars burned, symbols of authority reduced to smoldering wreckage. And the hum of daily life was drowned by the deafening wail of sirens and the angry chants of protesters, a cacophony of chaos echoing through the streets. For some, it was pure, unadulterated chaos, a descent into anarchy. For others, it was a desperate outcry from the unheard, a primal scream for recognition and justice. Law enforcement struggled to respond, overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the unrest, while state leaders pleaded for calm, urging restraint and dialogue, and deployed the National Guard in a desperate attempt to restore order. The world watched with bated breath as California teetered on the edge of collapse, wondering what this unprecedented crisis meant, not just for California, but for the very fabric of America. Into this volatile situation stepped President Donald J. Trump, never one to shy away from a crisis, viewing the chaos as a complete and utter failure of local leadership, a breakdown of law and order that demanded immediate intervention, demanding a strong federal response, a show of force to quell the unrest and restore control. He saw the situation not as a nuanced social issue, a complex web of historical injustices and systemic inequalities, but as a fundamental problem of order, a challenge to authority that needed to be swiftly and decisively crushed, one he was determined to solve with decisive action, with the full force of the federal government at his disposal. Trump's entry was not as a healer, a unifier, or a mediator seeking to bridge divides, but as a commander, a strong man ready to impose his will. Ready to impose his will on a state in turmoil, setting the stage for a showdown between federal power and the spirit of California. To understand the riots that engulfed California, you have to look beyond the immediate spark, beyond the headlines and the surface-level explanations. We need to delve into the underlying conditions, the simmering tensions that had been building for years, creating a tinderbox ready to ignite. California's shimmering facade of wealth and glamour often masks deep and troubling divides, a stark contrast between the haves and have-nots that fuels resentment and instability. The image of opulence clashes jarringly with the reality of widespread hardship. Soaring poverty rates, despite the state's economic power, leave many struggling to survive. The unhoused population continues to grow, a visible symbol of systemic failures. Unaffordable housing costs have priced out entire generations, forcing families into precarious living situations and fueling a sense of desperation. The dream of homeownership feels increasingly out of reach, and stagnant wages failing to keep pace with the rising cost of living trap many in a cycle of poverty, working paycheck to paycheck with no hope of advancement. For many, the California dream, once a beacon of opportunity and prosperity, had become a cruel myth, a broken promise that fueled disillusionment. The dream was replaced by a pervasive sense of frustration and a feeling of being systematically left behind, ignored by those in power, and denied a fair chance at a decent life. Racial tensions and a deep-seated distrust in law enforcement ran deep within many communities, exacerbated by historical injustices and ongoing disparities. Communities of color felt disproportionately targeted and unheard, their voices marginalized and their concerns dismissed by the very institutions meant to protect them. The controversial verdict that ultimately ignited the riots was not an isolated incident, but rather seen as the latest in a long and painful line of injustices, a stark reminder of systemic inequities. Politically, California was already deeply at odds with the Trump administration, a battleground for conflicting ideologies and policy agendas. This created an environment of intense political polarization and mutual suspicion, further dividing the state and the nation. State officials harbored deep concerns that any federal intervention would be politically motivated, used as a weapon to undermine their progressive policies. Meanwhile, the White House was quick to blame California's progressive policies for the unrest, engaging in a familiar game of political blame. The explosion of anger that erupted onto the streets was more than just a reaction to a single event. It was a raw and visceral expression of deep-seated despair. It was a desperate demand to be seen, to be heard, and to finally have their grievances addressed. Into this already volatile and highly charged situation, the president's message was about to land like a match thrown into a powder keg, further amplifying the stakes and promising to escalate the conflict to a dangerous new level. As images of chaos, of burning buildings and clashes between protesters and law enforcement filled the news, the nation held its breath. The scale of the unrest was unprecedented, and the demand for leadership was palpable. President Trump responded swiftly, on Twitter. His preferred method of communication became the nation's window into his immediate thoughts and strategies. Law and order became his rallying cry, a phrase echoing through the digital landscape and onto the streets. It was a clear signal of his stance. He immediately began framing the riots as a failure of democratic leadership, placing blame squarely on those governing the affected areas. This was a calculated move, designed to galvanize his supporters and undermine his political rivals. His statements were not about unity, not about healing or finding common ground. They were about strength and condemnation, a firm declaration of his authority, and a harsh judgment of those he deemed responsible. He threatened to deploy the military if order wasn't restored, a move that sparked immediate controversy and raised questions about the limits of federal power. This was a move bypassing traditional protocols and escalating the situation, further inflaming tensions and deepening the divide. Federal agents were put on standby, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice, and the Department of Justice was directed to pursue federal prosecutions, signaling a zero-tolerance approach to the unrest. Trump's approach was proactive intervention, a forceful assertion of federal power in the face of what he perceived as local incompetence. He was asserting federal authority over what was usually a state matter, a move that challenged the established balance of power and ignited a debate about states' rights. His message: Washington was in charge, and he would not hesitate to use the full force of the federal government to restore order. The president branded himself as the law and order leader, a figure of strength and resolve in a time of perceived chaos. He was appealing directly to his base and turning a state crisis into a national spectacle, using the unrest to further solidify his support and advance his political agenda. By contrasting his tough stance with what he called weak local leadership, he created a clear dichotomy. In doing so, he defined the conflict for the country, framing it as a battle between strength and weakness, order and chaos. His response was less about resolving California's crisis, less about finding common ground, and more about solidifying his political position. It was more about drawing a sharp line between his vision and that of his opponents, a clear demarcation of ideological territory. The nation watched, captivated and divided, as the president's words fueled the fire, further inflaming an already volatile situation. California's leaders pushed back hard. Governor Newsom rejected Trump's characterization and federal intervention, insisting California could handle its own crisis. In a televised address, he acknowledged protesters' pain, but condemned violence, calling for reform and dialogue. Local officials echoed his stance, arguing Trump's rhetoric only made things worse. They feared federal agents would escalate tensions and undermine trust. Behind the scenes, tense calls and legal threats underscored the standoff. California's leaders saw the crisis as a social issue needing reform. Trump saw it as a security problem demanding force. The philosophical divide left little room for cooperation. Instead of unity, the nation saw a public feud as cities burned. The crisis became a battle not just for order, but for the soul of American leadership. The rift between state and federal government was now on full display. On California's streets, Trump's words polarized the public. For many protesters, his law and order stance confirmed their fears and fueled further demonstrations. The protests grew, now targeting the federal administration as much as local injustice. Media coverage split along partisan lines. Some praised Trump's strength, others condemned his divisiveness. Supporters saw a president defending order, critics saw an authoritarian overreach. Social media and polls reflected the divide with hashtags and outrage on both sides. For Trump's base, he was protecting the nation; for opponents, he was deepening the crisis. The riots became a national referendum on Trump's presidency. The country was more divided than ever. Presidential responses to unrest are always measured against history. After the 1992 LA riots, President George H.W. Bush sent troops only after a governor's request and addressed the root causes. Lyndon Johnson combined force with policy, launching the Kerner Commission to investigate and address inequality. Even Eisenhower, sending troops to Little Rock, framed it as a reluctant step to uphold the law, not a political attack. Trump's response was unique, focused on domination and political messaging, with little public interest in underlying grievances. Where past presidents sought unity or reform, Trump concentrated on blame and federal power. His rhetoric was confrontational, not conciliatory. This marked a shift from commander-in-chief and healer to political combatant. The precedent was set. A president could now define unrest as a partisan battle. The nation's approach to crisis leadership had changed. Despite criticism, many Americans rallied behind Trump's tough approach. Supporters saw the riots as insurrection, not protest, and praised his willingness to call it out. Conservative voices amplified his stance, demanding overwhelming force to restore order. Business owners devastated by looting wanted action, not politics. For them, Trump was a bulwark against chaos, willing to do what others wouldn't. This security-first mindset drove support, rooted in the belief that order is the foundation of freedom. Critics saw a nation striving for justice. Supporters saw a nation under attack. For Trump's base, he was defending America, not dividing it. The line in the sand was clear: order above all. Critics accused Trump of abusing power and escalating the crisis. Civil rights leaders and legal experts warned his rhetoric incited division, not peace. The NAACP and former defense officials condemned the idea of using the military against Americans. Legal concerns centered on the Posse Comitatus Act and the high bar for military intervention. Even moderate Republicans expressed unease, longing for empathy and unity. Senator Romney and others called for a president who could condemn violence while acknowledging injustice. Critics argued Trump failed the test of leadership, using his office to deepen divisions for political gain. In their view, he chose to be a commander for his base, not a unifier for the nation. As calm returned, the scars of the riots and Trump's response remained. The feud between California and the White House hardened, making future cooperation difficult. Trump's playbook, direct intervention, inflammatory rhetoric, set a new precedent for crisis leadership. The episode exposed deep national divisions over race, justice, and the role of government. The president's response amplified these divides, leaving the country more polarized. The media's split-screen coverage showed a nation unable to agree on facts, let alone solutions. The legacy, a fundamental question about the presidency's role: unifier or combatant. The answers will shape America's future, as the questions ignited in California continue to